Welcome to the Research Works podcast, live from the European Academy of Childhood Disability Conference 2024 in Bruges, Belgium. Join us for interviews with keynote speakers, world-renowned researchers and clinicians, and behind-the-scenes stories from one of the great paediatric conferences in the world.
Well, I'm a little bit giddy with excitement today because these are two authors that I've read so much of their papers. I know it sounds like I'm gushing a little bit here, but I do read a lot of their stuff. So Adam Shortland and Martin Gough from the Evelina London Children's Hospital and the Guy's and St Thomas NHS Foundation Trust.
Welcome. Said, Jane. That was hard.
Thank you. Well, I think that's about as hard as it gets. And now we can have the conversation. My goodness, thank you so much for your time with me today. It's amazing to have you here in person, and how great is it to have a conference in person?
Oh, yes.
Isn't it?
Yes. Oh, yes.
To see people and...
Well, it's mixed, obviously. There's some people you like to see and others you're not
so
bothered
away from
about. But yes, generally you're absolutely right.
Now, what you're both really well known for, you published a lot together, and there's so much work that comes to muscle. If you're going to name you guys, the first thing that comes to mind is muscle. So I thought maybe that would be a really good thing to start off with. And I really do want to also talk about your keynote as well, Martin, because that was very thought-provoking, and there's so much to think about. And I love that you can come out of a session and go, oh, let's think about that a bit more. I really like that.
Well,
just not just to keep going with what we're doing. Let's just stop and think about it. But muscle,
yes.
Adam.
Yes, it's
where
important.
are we up to? Where are we up to? Because I feel like there's a lot of work in this area.
Yeah.
A lot of people are interested in this area
Sure.
now. So, a lot of that is because you've made people aware of it and people have come along. It's brilliant.
I think over the last perhaps 24, 25 years, there's been a real interest in muscle and cerebral palsy. And I think before that we had a kind of mythology about what a contracture was.
Yes.
And maybe we still do a little bit, but now we are starting to understand a little bit more, both at the gross morphological level and also more now about the subcellular components of developing contracture. And perhaps we understand now, perhaps more than we did, that it's important.
Yeah.
In a world dominated by neurologists, where is the myology? And actually the myology is coming to the fore, in that sense that we're starting to understand it may have an important role in the decline of mobility.
Yes.
If we consider that we probably have to take a wider view, but if we take a very simple view at first and say, okay, the original neurological lesion is static, and so what accounts for this decline in mobility that we see? Well, it could be the decline in muscle function, and what we understand is that muscles compared to body weight are on a different trajectory in individuals with cerebral palsy than they would be in a typically developing person.
Yes.
And later on, when your body weight gets too big and your muscles can't catch up, then it's sensible to suggest that might lead to a decline in your mobility.
Yeah, and that lovely graph that you have that you just
described. Yes, I know. It's funny enough. I always thought it was my own, but actually, I must give credit elsewhere, because I was just actually reading the other day that in the literature to do with elder people, that actually it comes up quite a lot, and actually they predate me. So I should give credit where it's due. I can honestly say that I didn't mean to usurp them, but I accidentally did.
Well, that's the observation we see. In
So I know it's a concept.
Yeah.
And that's important to distinguish from. We do definitely need to do researches to sort of fill that
empirical
out.
data.
Yeah, empirical data to fit the concept and maybe match those things up. So at the moment, it remains kind of like a convenient description, but not fully supported. So we need to be careful about it. But I think people recognise now that muscle is important.
Yeah.
It's likely to be a critical factor in the decline in mobility.
And I think that's so important to talk about. In my head, I'm thinking of quite a few things, so let me be ordered in what I'm going to ask you. We often think about cerebral palsy, and I'm certainly, when I was trained, cerebral palsy, brain, it's in the name, and the muscles are kind of like the secondary, it's being subjected, there's the positive and the negative upper motor neuron deficits that you might see. And muscle always seemed to be this downstream effect. But we're seeing it very differently at the moment, aren't we? And that's shattering a lot of preconceptions.
Well, there's some great work from Copenhagen, Herskind et al., a little while back now, 8 years or so, and others subsequently looking at muscle growth in very young individuals. I think the Leuven group now are doing quite a lot of stuff on that.
Yes.
And that's really interesting because what it suggests is that actually develops before we clinically see it.
Yeah.
Right? The problem develops before we clinically see it, and that's important. And it leads into what Martin was talking about in his plenary today, that we've got to think of cerebral palsy more like a system of problems rather than, it's the muscle or it's the brain.
That's
it's
right.
This whole
it was too
thing
simple.
together.
We've made it too simple, really.
Yeah.
And well, that's a beautiful segue, Martin. Like I said, I walked out of there going, I've got a lot to think about.
That's good.
Which is probably what
That's
you
what
hope
you
to
want
do.
from a keynote, isn't it?
Yeah, so for those who either went and want to relive it, or for those who are going, Dana, what are you going on about? Why was it so thought-provoking? Please, can you summarize it? I mean, you had a great lead into it the whole way as well, so it feels hard to summarize, but it's a beautiful concept.
What we looked at, it was a keynote on neuromuscular development. So what we wanted to look at was to put neuromuscular development in the context of as Adam said, the overall person, and think of it in a system concept, and taking a step back, because we get to a lot of the work on muscle tends to be observational. So it's very valuable, but unless you have a concept driving the observations, you may not be able to apply them as well as you otherwise could. And the aim of today really was to give people a good time and maybe if realist, to help to maybe think about things that you wouldn't typically have. But there's a value too, because if you step back, if we start looking at things like energetics and pathways, you understand that there may be causal pathways in that sense that we haven't necessarily considered, that we may be, our success as a species, if you discount global warming, is probably has an inverse of susceptibility to mortality and morbidity in infants. So if you look at the lower income countries, it's a huge, in neonatal mortality, infant mortality is a huge problem, and that may come about almost directly as a consequence of how we evolved to be successful adults. That we, as long as a certain proportion of adults got through, evolution could sustain, evolution is nasty, it could sustain a certain number of children dying, that wasn't a byproduct. And it may well be then that what we see as cerebral palsy is, in a sense, has a broader spectrum. It still involves brain injuries, and we're not trying to say it doesn't, but it may well be that we have a system where you have a brain which is uniquely needy and uniquely powerful. It can deny other body systems. So that is speculative. And then you have muscles which are not on the priority list. If you want to survive, you need your brain and you need your liver and you need your kidneys. You can, muscles are not, in terms of life, they're not the first choice.
Yes.
And I think the sorry, I was supposed to be summarising and I wasn't. I was tangenting.
No, it's okay. I'm still captivated.
It was just about how it would be wrong to say that we chose an evolutionary path, because there isn't such a thing. It's a natural selection. But we arrived through a force of selection and through a force of steps that presumably selected for those adults with more brain development after birth would have been, this is again speculative, would have been able to participate more in language, absorb more of the culture, communicate together, work together. So one of the concepts, the capacities of humans is abstract thought. Looking at the Neanderthals were more evolutionarily successful than we were for a period. They lasted for much longer. We came in later. One of the suggestions is that humans made musical instruments, made jewelry, that we had somehow a greater capacity for abstract thought. And that may have been what
it's an interesting hypothesis that you're using the hypothesis there, that actually evolutionary drive, or how I should say, what benefits us is, the formation of society, and what do we need for society, where we need brains, language, culture, and the rest. So that is as much a driver as anything else. I love your slide with the little depictions of cavemen and working in groups and things. But it's true, isn't it? We survive because we form societies, right? I mean, that's.
And we've inherited a biology, so we can't change it. But what we can do is maybe try to understand it and put cerebral palsy. We needed to look at muscle, because if you think of the immensity of a person. Any one of us, you can't summarize any one person by a few words. They'll always be greater than what you can say. And in the same way, if we're trying to look at something scientifically, we have to limit the focus. We have to narrow it down. We have to say we're looking at this in this context.
Yes.
We're looking at something which is a lifelong process, but we have to look at it at one point in time.
Yes.
We've no option, but maybe as long as we're doing that in the context that this is a system problem, that we come as a package, not as a muscle.
Yeah.
Then it allows interactions to be considered.
Yes.
And that was what the keynote was about.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the priority, and you're right, it's good to just remember the priority is the brain.
Yeah.
And a lot of energy goes there. And I love you had this beautiful graph. I can't remember where it was from. You might need to remind me. And it had the GMFCS levels and the growth of muscles.
That was one of the Nathalie de Buckelaar, who's one of the researchers from Leuven.
Yes.
And that was published last year in Developmental Medicine and Child Neurology, and that was a really nice paper because then that, obviously, as a presenter, you're going to pick those papers which support your view. So not that there's any bias, but you know, it's really intriguing because a lot of the idea so far has been we've come up with concepts like spasticity and tone.
Yeah.
But in a 6-month-old, that's not an issue. So if your muscles already are small at 6 months,
then
the model we have isn't covering things.
We haven't quite covered it. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And there's been such a shift. I know we've been talking so much about, getting kids up on their feet earlier, get them to on-time mobility framework, regardless of GMFCS level, let's make sure they're moving and doing all of that. And my question I sort of had for you based on this concept was, if we are, I guess my very simplistic form of understanding it was there's this almost survival mechanism here. And for these children, a lot of these children I do see, they're not particularly chubby children. You know, they don't have that high fat that we often see in the thighs. And there's often nutritional intake can be quite poor, whether there's difficulty with swallowing or whether that might be the case, but they don't tend to be heavy children.
Yeah.
If we're getting them moving and we're getting them to be really active, is there a question there that we need to think about? Is that a priority? Like, are we expending too much energy moving? Do we need to think about that when we're building muscle? What's the balance?
I think
I'm just going to say that it's like a lot of research, isn't it? That we take specific interventions like nutrition, say, or exercise, and we look at that in a very specific way. And the problem almost with research in general, in how it's conducted. We tend to get grants for looking at a very specific intervention. And it's very difficult to build the rationale on that basis. I mean, what Martin did very cleverly was bring it all together to elucidate a grander system. So the danger is, what I'm trying to get to is danger is that you make an intervention without fully understanding the system. So like for example, I'm not picking on nutrition particularly, but like a nutrition, nutrition, but you've got to have a system that can accept it and utilize it. And if that's not available...
Typically more involved children who have gastrostomy tubes put in for feeding. They put on lots of fat, but they don't put on muscle. So they're still they're getting ample nutrition. But there's something in their muscle that's... But I think too, when you mentioned about moving, I think, and this is more personal or the standard view, I think we have to think about the person, because we talk about cerebral palsy, but it doesn't actually exist independently of the people who have it. So it's not, we create like one of Plato's forms, we create this ideal. And then we discuss it as if it somehow affected children. And it's not, it's a construct. And again, it's about identifying what's achievable. So if you have somebody up and moving and walking and they're able to do it, they're making progress, then that's great. But if you have somebody, as you said, somebody up and moving and walking who's not able to do it and who's using energy, but they're also using time, their time, their parents' time. So time that the parents could give to them and to other siblings is being spent doing something that they may never be able to achieve. So I think avoiding a kind of a normative approach, that maybe we should look that there are trajectories, and within that trajectory, we can maybe improve it to an extent, or we can make it worse. And then not trying to, because the drive is to turn everybody into people who don't have cerebral palsy.
Yeah.
I think it's also to do with how we develop interventions, how we think about interventions. Typically, we prescribe an intervention, and in something so heterogeneous, that might work for like a very narrow, specific condition where you're trying to prod a molecule or something. But when it's got so many biological consequences that you're trying to imagine, then picking on one thing amongst that array of things, or that system of things, in fact, then you're, no wonder we don't do so well in terms of our results, in terms of our effect sizes for our treatments.
And that's really interesting. I've been hearing that a lot through a lot of the conference is, these interventions being developed, but we've got these outcome measures. They're not really showing what we think they want to see, but because we're being very specific with our intervention, but the outcome measure might be quite broad, and appreciating the true impact that has is actually quite difficult to elucidate. And there's so many factors to consider within that.
So it's an interesting thing, isn't it? You do a research works podcast.
Yes.
And in a sense, the research paradigm is almost wrong, that we're driven to do specific interventions almost by the framework we are in. The move towards real world data, if we could only manage it statistically and extract the meaning from it, I think is where we should be going. And building highly developed rational models before we extract from the observational data, and trying to understand the causal processes that go within. Whereas RCTs, we're going to be around for 1 million years before we get to the point where we've elucidated, all the components of this very complex system.
Yeah, there's so much richness in data. If it can be collected well within a system that's protected, everyone, that needs to be really important. But myself, I'm looking into learning healthcare systems and looking into ways of using data well to be able to learn from that data to inform clinical practice. And it's just another way to look at data and another way to do research, I suppose. And you can answer a lot of questions really dynamically from that as the data comes in.
And it's a good point, because it's about a little bit about exploration as opposed to the drive to a solution. We're so focused on solving, and we're less focused on exploring. And I think that is, and we need to do a bit more exploring first.
And I love that, and that's what you talked about today. It's the concept of exploration, and almost in a way never be too arrogant about what we think we know, because there's a whole lot of stuff we don't know. But taking that moment, stepping back, and that's certainly what I got out of it, and I'm really grateful for that.
Great.
Yeah, thank you so very much for that. And look, there's so much more to talk about, and I feel like it's one of those things that hopefully for listeners, it's be that moment to reflect and think about what we're doing.
We invite everybody to come to the office. They can sit down when we're having our Friday afternoon chat. And,
well, let's all get invited to that, please. So I'm looking for the invite, and let's have a good chat, and let's solve the world's problems from there.
It's very important, that communication, right, between people, and
really it's amazing what can happen over just a conversation and a drink in hand, possibly. So maybe tonight we can have another chat about that.
See you there, Dana.
I'll see you there. Thanks to all of our listeners. Hope you enjoyed that. We'll talk to you all again really soon. Thanks, and bye.
Bye.